Hi folks, welcome to May's Wrap Up, and we're going to cover all 11 books that I read. I'm going to tier rank them, and then I'm going to declare a book of the month. But first, there were two books that I didn't get to that were on my planned TBR for May, and they are The Secret City by Carol Emshwiller, which is on the Broderick and DeFilippo list, so it's a bit of a shame that I just ran out of time. And also Space Machine by Christopher Priest, a sort of H.G. Wells time machine / War of the Worlds mashup. And those will just go back on the shelves and they'll live to fight another day. What did I actually read in May? The first book that I read was The Colour of Distance by Amy Thomson, and this is actually pretty hard to find in the UK. There was no UK edition, and there were even the US edition only had one printing, or maybe two, with a smaller format paperback. So actually, I had to pay big bucks for this one to be shipped over from the US. But anyway, in the story, the main character is a female survey scientist. She's a xenobiologist, Dr. Juna Sari, and she's been stranded on an alien world. And the book opens with her close to death, having succumbed to some. I think her team crash landed, and her suit was damaged, and the atmosphere is not conducive to human life. That the atmosphere is effectively toxic, or at least engenders a strong allergic reaction. So she's on the verge of death. And the local aliens, the Tendu, fortunately for Juna, find her. And they have a means of, on their wrists, they have this kind of spur through which they can connect to each other, which is what they mainly use it for, but also to any other life form. And so that's a bit odd. And then they, through this connection, the particularly skillful among them can alter the biological makeup of the other party, in this case of Juna, and they essentially fix her, having stabilised her first. And fixing her means that they change her internal biology so that she can now breathe the atmosphere, which is handy, otherwise it would have been a very short book. And that fixing comes at some cost to the fixer, as we find out as the book progresses. So Juna's taken back to their village and kind of nursed, somewhat grudgingly, it must be said. And she's referred to often as the new creature, and she's new in more ways than one. And although rescue will come, it's several years away. And in the meantime, she just needs to fit into the Tendu way of life. And that's really the crux of this story. The Tendu haven't evolved any means of verbal communication, and all of their communication is through colour and patterns on their skin. They don't wear any clothes for communication reasons. And part of Juna's fixing is that her skin has been altered as well, so that her skin can now, although not as effectively as the Tendu, can now communicate words and feelings and so on, although she has to learn how to do that. Juna's kind of looked after and effectively becomes a Padawan to one of the, that's not the term used in the book, to one of the village elders, as I said, grudgingly at first, but then, with some warmth. And in the following months, Juna learns the Tendu ways, she learns to communicate, and she impresses with her human strength and work rate. Juna, in turn, becomes, if I can continue the analogy, the Jedi Master, in turn to a young Tendu that, as part of the culture, was heading for certain death, being kind of stateless. And Juna effectively adopts him, forming quite a strong parental bond. And actually that relationship, I thought, was done really well, and packing quite an emotional punch as the story progresses. The world building in this book is first class. It's a richly described biology. It's an alien rainforest, but that world building is not gratuitous. It's not for its own sake. It's part of telling the story. And there are some complex dynamics between the Tendu within a village, and also between villages. And I thought those relationships, as I mentioned, were well done. There is some jeopardy and an important dilemma when Juna's rescue does eventually arrive. And I thought that the descriptions of the Tendu way of life were done really well. And I think if you liked Sue Burke's Semiosis or Adrian Tchaikovsky's Alien Clay, or if you just like a bit of biology in your science fiction and a bit less of the physics and the cosmology, then The Colour of Distance is a book that I'd really recommend to you. I'm grateful to Seth in particular for recommending this to me. I did really enjoy it. I give The Colour of Distance by Amy Thomson 8.5 out of 10, heading out of stellar splendour and into galactic gem territory. Next, on audiobook, I listened to The Quantum Magician by Derek Kunsken, and I don't actually have a physical copy of this. I just found it kind of traipsing through Audible to find something to read. The Quantum Magician is a sort of space opera come heist combination. And in this book, we're several hundred years in the future. Kunsken has extrapolated from the nation states of today, and it's a kind of splintered humanity that's spanned across the whole of the solar system. There's a wormhole network which has been left by some kind of long gone forerunner aliens, and I thought the author did a pretty good job with the setting. It's a richly imagined universe, and humanity is splintered into many factions, both politically and genetically. Belisarius is the main character, and he's a Homo quantus, a sort of genetically engineered mentat, if I can borrow a term from June. And he's capable of what in the book is called in a fugue state of remarkable feats of analysis and calculation. But he's a bit broken. He ran away from the secluded Homo quantus school or development centre or whatever it was called, and he now makes a successful living as a con man and gambler. And Bell has a new client. He's been hired to spirit away a small fleet of innovative warships from under the noses of his clients' patrons. There's a strong Ocean's 11 vibe. There's an Ocean's 11 in space, effectively. Bell assembling a crew for this job from various branches of humanity. There's a puppet, which are like waist-high kind of miniature humans who were created originally as slaves to another branch of humans that also were involved in the novel. It turns out, but as more peripheral kind of characters. There's another Qantas, an old flame, human computer girlfriend, effectively. And there's a crazy French explosives expert, and there's a so-called mongrel who's a kind of genetically engineered human, and the mongrels have been gen-enged to live and work at great pressure at the sort of in the depths of an ocean world, and also are pretty handy at flying a starship in a vacuum. And amusingly too, there's an AI priest known as St. Matthew, who's intent on bringing back a form of Christianity to what's by this stage an irreligious future. And there are a few others as well, more peripheral characters. And actually that getting the band together takes quite a while. He goes on a bit of a grand tour of the solar system, gathering his troops, and maybe that section was a little bit overlong. So this is a tale of bluff and double bluff, cons within cons, with some added exotic physics and the promise of time travel too. And of course, if you're Bell, the prospect of a huge reward. There's lots of nice detail in the book. The variety of human subspecies was interesting. I thought the audiobook narration was actually very good. I thought the narrator, whose name I forget, did a nice job of the various accents. And actually, talking of accents, there were some really nice ideas in this book. One of them was there were different versions of French, for example, and you know, someone might be speaking Francais 8.1, which has a very specific purpose. And then the puppets and their religious ecstasies were fantastic, and with quite a lot of funny references to what they consider to be sacred religious texts, which are, of course, really anything but. And there's some really good banter between Marie, the French explosives expert, and the mongrel Stills. I thought was pretty good, creatively vicious in both directions. Overall, I thought it was a fun cast of characters. So it's a complex, interesting setting. The author sets a rollicking pace. There's good dialogue. It's an interesting cast. Plus, there's the fun of trying to figure out the true con as the layers of deception are peeled away. And so it was fun. There's another 2 books, and I'm not in any rush to get hold of physical copies, but I think I might quite like to read them at some point. Overall, I give Quantum Magician 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read Downbelow Station by C.J. Cherryh, and this, of course, is a classic space opera, but actually quite political, more political than I thought it was going to be. It maybe even a little bit dry, dense, but it did hold my interest. It wasn't boring at all. It just wasn't as kind of bangy, crashy as I thought it might be. And in this book, we're in the dog days of the war between the Earth Company and the Union. Pell Station is the main location for this book, colloquially known as Downbelow Station, and it's the meat in this war sandwich. It's a crucial base, and because it's got a sustaining planet down below, hence the name, on what are now the new borders of company/union space. Both parties want control of Pell Station and the planet that it orbits, which puts the stationers in a bit of a difficult position. They attempt to be neutral, but they are caught between 2 hostile parties. So there's a lot of political infighting on the station and a lot of espionage and counter-espionage, and all of that going on whilst the station is dealing with housing thousands of desperate refugees brought in from other stations that have been destroyed in the war. I thought that there's a nice background tension from Downbelow Station being a very vulnerable orbiting facility in a time of war, particularly when many others have been destroyed, which is all too easy to do. If I say densely written, that sounds like it might be bad, but I think it's good. It's just lots of details, which is something to kind of dive into and revel, I think. I enjoyed the Ctein family, who are the sort of main characters, or among the main characters. They're the kind of leaders among the stationers, and then amongst the company fleet, you've got Sinew Mallory, who's I thought initially starts off as being a nasty piece of work, but her character kind of develops nicely as the book progresses. She's tough but fair, and increasingly at odds with her quixotic fleet captain. There are, as I mentioned, secret agents, and even secret agents that have forgotten, they've been programmed to forget that they're secret agents, and then there's plot and counterplot. I found it quite claustrophobic in a good way, just because of the setting. It's mostly on Downbelow Station or on cramped spaceships, or there are some passages that are down on the planet, but even there you can't breathe the air, so you've got a mask on, so it has to have a claustrophobic feel to it, I thought. In this book, we get the origin story of the Alliance, which in Downbelow Station is a ragtag assembly of merchant ships trying to stay alive, mainly to stay neutral, to stay out of the way. But they do play an increasingly robust role as the book progresses. I thought that the Downers, so-called, the local sentient life from the planet, are a nice touch, playing an increasingly critical role as the situation on both the station and on the planet down below becomes more and more critical. The Downers appear sort of childlike and quite dependent on their humans, but much less so than it appears, it turns out. I did enjoy the glimpses of the wider universe in which this story sits, and you rightly get the impression that there are many more stories to be told. Of course, there are, I don't know how many dozens probably of books in the Alliance Union universe. I enjoyed it. I mean, it didn't knock my socks off, but I did enjoy it, and certainly I wasn't put off, far from it, reading any more CJ Cherryh books, which is a good thing because I've got a bunch of them on my shelves. I give Downbelow Station 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, I read Upgrade by Blake Crouch, author, of course, of Dark Matter. And this is another page-turner, much like Dark Matter. We're in the nearish future, in the aftermath of some genetic accident which caused the death of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Caused, it turns out, by a mistake of hubris by Dr. Ramsey, the mother of the main character, Logan Ramsey, who did jail time just for being her lab assistant. The mother apparently topped herself driving off a cliff. Or did she? The protagonist now works for the GPA, which is an enforcement agency that deals with genetic crimes, of which there are now many, most forms of genetic manipulation or even research having been outlawed after the disaster. And Ramsey is called to investigate a crime. He's lured, in fact, into a dangerous situation and caught in a bomb blast. But it's not any old bomb, and he waits to find himself in hospital, not too badly wounded. And over the following days and weeks, he starts to feel ill, but also better. He can see better, he can hear better, even think better. He feels stronger and faster. He feels upgraded. How, and perhaps more importantly why that's happened, is the central mystery of the book. The authorities become interested in his new capabilities, and he has to do a runner to escape, aided by a mystery benefactor that may or may not have his best interests at heart. There's then a lot of chasing around the country as Ramsey plays hide and seek with various parties, honing his upgraded capabilities so that he hopes, eventually win the day. I suppose we could say that Upgrade is hard science fiction, in that there's a lot of gobbledygook spoken about, gene combinations, perhaps actually more than I'd have liked, that have been upgraded, which at least makes it sound sciencey, or at least potentially extrapolated from a plausible scientific base. But really, let's be honest, it's a thriller with some sci-fi trimmings. It's kind of silly, but it was kind of kinetic fun whilst you're in it. And I actually found the same with Dark Matter, to be honest. I would describe it as something along the lines of a fun beach read, the kind of book that you might pick up in an airport. It didn't engage too much in my brain, but it was fun while it lasted. I would describe it as sort of disposable or forgettable. I found this copy in a charity shop, actually, and I think it can go back there. And that's fine. I enjoyed it while it lasted. It's just not a keeper. It's not a book that I want to retain for my collection. I give Upgrade, therefore, 6 out of 10. It's a nebulous narrative. Next, I read Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut, and me and Kurt have a bit of history. So this was my second Vonnegut, the first being Sirens of Titan, which is, many people think a classic science fiction, but mine was not a happy experience. It was just too absurd for me, and I didn't get on with Vonnegut's humour, at least as it appeared in the Sirens of Titan. I thought it was a kind of pointless book. That wasn't an awesome introduction to this great of American science fiction, and arguably of literature generally. But prompted by the Broderick and DeFilippo list of 101 best science fiction novels, I ended up with Galapagos on my reading list for May. I found that it was available free with my Audible membership, so I decided to let my ears take the strain and give it a listen rather than ingesting it through my eyes, as is traditional. So in Galapagos, Vonnegut envisages a world going to pot. There isn't enough food, there are too many people, although that's rapidly becoming less of an issue due to a world-spanning infertility crisis. So it's the end of the world as we know it, and Vonnegut proposes that's all because our brains are too damn big. They just get us into all sorts of bother. Galapagos is narrated by Leon Trout, who is the son of Kilgore Trout, it turns out, the fictional author of many terrible science fiction books, who's a frequent reference in Vonnegut's novels, or so I gather. So Leon is a ghost, and he's telling the tale from 1,000,000 years in the future, where Homo sapiens have thrived in this new world by ditching the sapient part. We've now got smaller brains, and we're just getting into less trouble all round. But how do we get there? In what I imagine is typical of Vonnegut's style, the answer is in rather absurd fashion. A small group of people are gathered in some Ecuadorian port town, expecting to go on the heavily advertised nature cruise of the century to the Galapagos Islands. There should be hordes of rich and famous people waiting to go on that cruise too, including Jackie Onassis, but events in the wide world have prevented them from attending. And we're introduced to this sort of motley group of characters as the book progresses. And as base clay for the future of humanity, they're a rather unimpressive group. There's a pompous but incompetent captain of the ship, the only man in the final party, actually, unfortunately, for the future of the human race, fertile. There's a widow who's only there because her husband went a bit doolally and booked the cruise with their retirement funds and then promptly died, his dying wish being that she go on the cruise or by herself. There's a philandering conman, a rich industrialist and his blind daughter, a Japanese inventor and his heavily pregnant flower-arranging wife, and eventually a group of 5 or 6 illiterate Kankabono cannibals from the jungle. Vonnegut does some nice, if slightly alarming, predicting in this book. There's a financial crash, there's a pandemic, and bearing in mind that this was published in 1985, pre-internet and pre-smartphone, and where mobile computers were the size and weight of a ship anchor. He imagines a box of tricks called Mandarax, which is a sort of combination of Google and ChatGPT, in a handy plastic case with a small screen, which sounds awfully familiar. And actually that Mandarax is the only piece of working technology to make it to the remote Galapagos Islands, where our small group eventually fetch up, more by luck than judgment, it turns out. So the book is mostly about them getting to the island, with the final quarter or so telling of their life there and of their descendants and their descent into a more simple, more animal, happier, untroubled, smaller-brained existence. So unlike Sirens of Titan, I did not hate this book. I was happy to have it read to me. It's not a laugh a minute or anything, but there's a wry humour in this book I found. Reminded me a little bit, actually, of Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon Tales, if you've read those. So I wouldn't say I'm exactly converted to the Church of Vonnegut, but Galapagos did repair some of the damage that was done by Sirens of Titan. I give Galapagos 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read My Dirty Little Book of Stolen Time by Liz Jensen. It's narrated by the protagonist Charlotte, and she's a part-time prostitute from late 19th century Copenhagen, and she's the proverbial tart with a heart. But she's unable to shake off a lumpen, poorly educated woman, Mrs. Schleswig, that people assume is her mother. And maybe she is, although Our Lady of the Night denies it categorically and repeatedly throughout the book. Charlotte blags her way into the service of the widow Crack, who's a rather austere woman who, rumour has it, has bumped off her husband, who's vanished without a trace. Charlotte and Mrs. Schleswig are engaged to clean the large house from top to bottom in anticipation of a visit from the widow's new husband-to-be. But the house harbours dark secrets, including a strange machine in the forbidden corner of the basement. Yes, it's a time machine. So the guts of the story are Charlotte and Mrs. Schleswig's misadventures as they're catapulted into our current, into the 21st century. I enjoyed Jensen's prose style in this book. It's very light in tone, but also quite ornate, narrated as it is by Charlotte, who's a product of the late 19th century. She's quite a cheeky individual, and there are lots of amusing asides as she tells the story. Pace is frenetic, almost kind of knockabout and breathless. We get to experience our current era through the eyes of a young lady from an entirely different world. And she marvels at some of the technology available to us, unimaginable from her era. Almost inevitably, Charlotte falls in love with a 21st century chap, her modern day Darcy, who's barely hanging on as Charlotte runs rings around him, beguiling him with her wit and uncomplicated approach. Plus, she has a certain set of skills from her nighttime occupation back in the 19th century. I also enjoyed the sections in turn of the century Denmark, where introduced to several interesting characters, and the period details seem convincing enough in as far as I'm able to judge. It is fun stuff, arguably pretty silly in some respects, and a little suspension of disbelief is certainly required, but no more than for a certain H.G. Wells novel that covers some of the same ground. The breathless pace and the rather endearing innocence, but not that innocent, of Charlotte, plus some of the relationships that she forms whilst on her travels, particularly with the daughter of the man that she falls in love with, all serve to paper over any cracks that there might be. I enjoyed it. I give my dirty little book of stolen time 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read Saturn Run by John Sandford and somebody called Ctein, and something has been spotted heading into the solar system from interstellar space, and shock horror, as is often the way with these things, it's decelerating. It must be a spaceship, right? Whatever it is, it soon buggers off again, but it's clearly stopped for a while in Saturn's rings, and there's speculation as to what that might be for. Is it a refuelling stop? Is it a depot? Might there be alien technical goodies there for the taking? The good old US of A can't possibly let the Chinese get there first, but inconveniently, they don't actually have a spaceship handy that can make the voyage. Space Station 3 is minding its own business, being a base for science in high Earth orbit. And someone has a bright idea of strapping some engines and a cooling system onto Space Station 3 and sending it to Saturn. There's a fun section where the authors go to town on some of the modifications needed to do just that, and some assembling of a suitable crew. Ctein, the co-author, is a photographer by trade, so perhaps it's no surprise that one of the main characters is a devastatingly handsome, rather like me, photographer. And as a result, perhaps there's more nerdy detail about cameras and lenses than I really wanted or needed to know. But our handsome photographer is also rich, and he's an ex-Special Forces operator and a bit of a ladies' man to boot. So I suspect that Ctein had fun writing him into the story. The aforementioned Chinese have a mission to Mars, which I think is already on its way as the story begins. And they have to make some hurried modifications of their own to change their mission up. And then we're in a race to Saturn. Both ships experience issues along the way, whether it's by accident or bodged modifications or sabotage, who knows. I quite enjoyed the bootstrapping of the spaceships, and that part reminded me of the opening section of Seven Eves, but without the imminent jeopardy of planetary destruction. I did find the stakes were a bit lower. I thought that the eventual arrival at Saturn was a bit of a damp squib, and the interaction with the alien tech was a bit simplistic, almost a bit of an afterthought, really. So I guess we could say that Saturn Run is more about the journey than the destination. The Chinese team were a little bit paint by numbers, but there is some nice political manoeuvring towards the end of the story, as both parties make desperate attempts to either obtain the alien technical goodies or prevent the other party from keeping it. So like Blake Crouch's Upgrade, it was kind of fun while it lasted, but unlike Seven Eves, which I've reread a few times, I doubt that I'll be going back to this one. Having had my fun with it, I don't think it deserves the considerable shelf space that it occupies, and unlike Upgrade, I should be moving on. I give Saturn Run 6 out of 10. It's another nebulous narrative. Next, I read Chaga by Ian McDonald, and this is all about a zone of weirdness, an oft-visited trope in science fiction. In this case, alien weirdness. Thematically, Chaga, or Evolution Shore, as it was published in the US, is in a dialogue with J.G. Ballard's The Crystal World, which is also set in Africa, actually, and then ranging forward perhaps to Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach books, or even Chris Beckett's Beneath the World of Sea. So in Chaga, one of Saturn's moons has disappeared, or it's rapidly being consumed by something, and it's kind of unexplained. And then something else explodes up around Saturn, ultimately sprinkling some debris on Earth in several places, actually. One of them in southern Kenya near Mount Kilimanjaro. From this impact point spreads inexorably a region of strange biology as new plant life, new or in some cases altered animal life. And it's moving, not that quickly, but 50 metres a day, every day, in every direction. McDonald apparently stole the idea of that kind of relentless growth of unstoppable biological change from the Genesis device in Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan, but just slowed it down an awful lot. So what took the Genesis device like a single day to do is the work of many years in Chaga. So this zone is known locally as the Chaga after it has consumed the tribal lands and indeed the tribe of the same name. Our protagonist in this book is Gabby McCaslan, a journalist from McDonald's native Northern Ireland. And Gabby is working for an international press agency in Kenya. And with the background of daily encroachment of the Chaga, the junior reporter Gabby is left to handle the and finally stories at the end of the evening news programme. But she's desperate to be taken more seriously as a journalist, and she's also fascinated by the Chaga and desperate enough to make some shady deals with the locals to get ahead. Whilst the UN tries to keep control to evacuate the affected areas, others reach an accommodation with the Chaga, accepting the changes that it brings, but gaining some advantages too. The Chaga then promises a changed world. Nothing can stop it. I enjoyed the Africanness of this book, if that's a thing. Ian McDonald obviously is a white guy from Northern Ireland, so for all I know, the setting is badly done or misappropriated from an African perspective. But McDonald does have form for doing a good job of setting his books in developing world settings and doing a sympathetic job of it, by which I don't mean, oh, poor Africans. I mean that it's set there with a strong sense of place, the sights and the smells, the people, the joys and the contradictions. It's within, not observed from without. Well, that's how it felt to me, another white guy. I'd be intrigued to know what a Kenyan would think reading this book, actually. But anyway, we get to see the underbelly of this Kenya with turf wars, criminal cyber gangs, fixers and private armies, all like sharks in a tank as the Chaga zone expands towards their patch. Gabby gets caught up in all of this as she seeks favours from people that can get her what she needs, and those dangerous chickens come home to roost as the story progresses. Gabby is a bit naive, she's impetuous, headstrong, but driven and ambitious, to a fault perhaps, and to the cost of those around her. She's maybe even a little bit unlikable as a character. Certainly she's not a mindless bimbo. At the time that he wrote this book in the early 1990s, AIDS and HIV were wreaking havoc in Africa, and McDonald wraps that into the story too, with the Chaga presenting some interesting opportunities, potentially a different way to approach a cure. I liked that the UN were not merely acting in a sort of paternal role. There were very mercenary ulterior motives. The containment of the zone and the protection of the richer regions of the world, the least among them. In this book, they're really not the good guys, or at least not exclusively so. I've read a few of McDonald's books yet, and I haven't yet read one that I didn't enjoy, and Chaga was no exception. I like McDonald's style. I like the vision that he brings of a future, unlike our present, a future in which the developing world is young, fresh, exciting, challenging, modern, and yet traditional. The advances in tech that the future brings, bringing opportunity, and in the case of the Chaga, some quite transformational change. I enjoyed it. I give Chaga 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next, I read Raft by Stephen Baxter, and I was excited to get into the well-regarded Zeely sequence, only to find that there are no actual Zeely in this book. And I'm not entirely sure how it links into the rest or why it's part of the Zeely sequence at all. I guess I have to read the others to find out. In fact, Raft wasn't really anything like I expected. I was expecting rock-hard science fiction. It's what Baxter's known for. But this was almost pulpy in some respects. It almost feels young adult in tone to start with, although that might be to do with the protagonist, Reese, who's a young lad at the start of the book. At the beginning, we find him as an apprentice miner. He's living on something called the Belt, which is a ramshackle arrangement of wood and metal. Baxter doesn't give too many clues to start with as to the nature of the setting, but they are there. The stars are just meters across, and the mine that he works in is the dead core of such a star, and gravity is strong here, 1 billion times stronger than in our universe, so strong that even human bodies exert a perceptible gravitational pull on each other. The Belt, and we discover the titular Raft, are both located in a nebula, a birthing zone for the teeny stars, but also giving a breathable and livable atmosphere and environment for our humans to live in. And I suppose the mystery is, how did they get there? And that's unknown to the majority of the population. They just are. But Reese is a curious chap, and he runs away to the Raft, which is the centre of all knowledge, hitching a lift on a flying supply tree. So he's a smart lad, and he wangles his way into the science labs on the Raft as an apprentice. As he learns, we learn. Many generations ago, humans arrived here in the nebula by accident. Their spaceship passing through some kind of gate or portal from another universe, one with different laws of physics, or at least a different gravity. Reese soon learns that the nebula is slowly dying, which ultimately spells doom for the humans that exist here, trapped in this strange environment. The crux of the story is the desperate attempts to solve this existential crisis, one in which Reese becomes increasingly central. There was more than a hint, I felt, of steampunk to Raft, although it was more of a regression to that state than an advance to it. There are bits and pieces of old ship tech kicking about, but most of it doesn't work anymore, or if it does, nobody really understands why or how it works. And there's an undercurrent of inequality, of rebellion, and even revolution in Raft. The structural instability of the hierarchy of engineers and scientists, the miners and workers, suffering a bit as the increasing difficulty of maintaining food and other supplies takes its toll. I liked Reese as a character, and there was a lot to like in the setting. The high gravity was mind-bending. It's natural to think, oh, hang on a minute, why isn't everyone just flattened or squished by gravity a billion times stronger than what we're used to? And it does make sense in the context of the book. There's some interesting wildlife sharing the nebula with our human folks, and there were some fairly out there aspects to this book. One in particular, just a bit jarring in terms of its plausibility, and it wasn't the flying trees. Baxter does throw the kitchen sink at the rafter, and perhaps it suffers a little bit as a result. There's just too much going on. But it was his debut novel, and while some of what Baxter becomes rightly renowned for is definitely there, it maybe has some rough edges. I give Raft 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read Neverness by David Zindell, thought by many to be a classic and often compared to Dune, and it was elevated by Broderick and DeFilippo to their list of 101 best science fiction novels to boot. So my expectations were therefore high going in, but what do I think? Have they been met? This is one of those books where the world, the universe, is gradually revealed through what the characters experience, their conversations, and their immediate surroundings, their throwaway remarks. There's very little explanatory exposition, no info dumping. Zindell therefore makes us work a little bit to build a picture. We're in the far future, a goodly period after something called the swarming, which seems to refer to some kind of exodus from Earth, a spreading of humanity amongst the galaxy. And that's long enough ago in the past that individual planets now have had thousands of years, I think, to develop different cultures, different ways of life, even different forms of humanity. We have faster than light travel, the trick to which is held by the pilots, who are a guild of mathematicians, to which our main character, Mallory Ringess, is apprenticed at the start of the book. There's something called the solid state entity, who's an AI so enormous and advanced that it's effectively a god, one of many actually that call a nebula home, using planet-sized computers and memory storage to make it work. Mallory effectively gets dared to try to penetrate the nebula and commune with the gods, a notoriously difficult and deadly task. And whilst he's there, he's told that the secret of immortality and potentially the future of the human race can be found in the DNA of the oldest humans. And what Mallory thinks are some of the oldest humans are Neanderthals. Let's get some Neanderthal DNA then. Handsily, there are several tribes of what are now called Alloy living in the frozen wastes on Icefall, which is where the city of Neverness is, whose ancestors long ago altered their DNA to be Neanderthal. And there's a long section, and maybe overlong in fact, which is a bit of a theme, preparing for the mission and living with the tribes, collecting their genetic material, and I'll leave that to your imagination, but it does include toenails and hair clippings and something a bit more biological. And there's a climactic end to this section which has consequences for the way that the rest of the book plays out, let's say. Mallory ends up spending some time on the ocean world of Agathangi, which reminded me of the pattern jugglers in the Revelation of Space universe. And over the course of several years, Mallory is rebuilt, he's rewired, improved. And Mallory returns to Neverness, to plotting, to schism, and even to war amongst the guild, and is forced to choose sides. In the meantime, somewhat alarmingly, stars have been exploding in an area called the Wild, and they're getting closer. And why? And how is this linked to Mallory's quest? I really like the rich language that Zindell uses. It actually reminded me a little bit of what I've read of Cordwainer Smith. Lots of unfamiliar words, which only become familiar, and you only begin to understand what they might mean through repeated kind of contextual use in the book. I liked the setting, Icefall, on which the city of Neverness, as I said, is located. It's a wintry world, and there's an awful lot of ice skating going on, in fact. And we get hints and eventually evidence of a much wider galaxy of inhabited planets out there beyond Icefall. The Neanderthal section, whilst it was a bit long, was pretty good. It was easy to forget for a while that we're in a science fiction book. They regressed very convincingly to hunter-gatherer society. I was interested in the solid state entity and the other gods of the piece. What role do they play and why? And I enjoyed the mathematical nature of the piloting. Mallory and his fellow pilots have to construct mathematical proofs on the fly in his head in order to map his way through hyperspace. On the debit side, Neverness is rather long. It's a chunky book, maybe even a little bit bloated, and it's not an effortless read. Zindell makes you work quite a bit for it, and it does take quite a while to get your eye in. So overall, I think I admired it more than I enjoyed it. Zindell is kind of surfing on a wave of Baroque science fiction that came before him, the likes of Jack Vance, Gene Wolfe, as I said, Cordwainer Smith, A.A. Atanasio maybe, and perhaps even Samuel Delany, are all lurking as possible influences. And like some of those, it may be that Neverness would benefit from a reread, but I'm not sure I'll be rushing to do that, quite honestly. I gather there's a follow-on trilogy, a Requiem for Homo sapiens, which has Mallory's son, Downbelow, as the main character. But you can read Neverness on its own. It's a fully contained story, and so you don't need to read the others to get the full tale. I give Neverness 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. My final read then of May was Eifelheim by Michael Flynn, which was on audiobook. And Eifelheim is a pleasing blend of first contact and historical fiction. Eifelheim has 2 plot threads. One of those plot threads is in our near future, possibly even our present day actually, where we follow a historian, Tom, as he tries to figure out why there's a gap in his historical topographic map of Germany. He concludes that there's a gap in the network of nodes, a place where there ought to be a settlement but isn't. The Black Death devastated entire villages in the 14th century, and so perhaps that's an explanation. But no, he rules that out, as without exception, all of those settlements were resettled as the population recovered, but not in this one place. And why is that? That is the central mystery of the modern day thread, as Tom and his librarian friend try to find evidence. And this thread was maybe a little bit less interesting than the other thread, which is set in the mid-14th century in the village of Oberhochwold, I think it was, which would eventually become Eifelheim. And the majority of the book, I would guess about 75%, is spent here. We meet numerous villagers, including the local priest, Dietrich, who's an educated man with a mysterious past. And in the beginning of the book, we hear dark hints that the plague, the Black Death, is spreading across Europe, laying waste to entire towns. But it's not here yet, and life continues in all of its feudal glory. A flash in the sky one evening attracts Dietrich's attention, and lo, it's a flipping flying saucer with actual aliens. The Kranken, as they come to be known, are gradually revealed to be insectoid, with an evolutionary past that involves something like a grasshopper, in the same way that ours involves apes. Dietrich overcomes his fear and begins to communicate with the Kranken via their translation gadget, which they conveniently brought with them. The majority of the book tells of the Kranken's attempts to get their ship's Fritz hyperspace drive working again, but that's an uphill battle, fibre optics not being something that the local smithy can easily knock up. Unable to leave, we witness the Kranken's gradual absorption into village life, including their exploration of Christian faith, encouraged, of course, by Father Dietrich. So Eifelheim is an exploration of faith, of hope, of deep theological questions. Can the aliens be Christians? What does it mean to be Christian? And can they be saved in a religious sense? I enjoyed the interactions between Dietrich, by the standards of his time, a learned man, and the Kranken, as they try to explain cosmology or electronics to Father Dietrich, or even the germ theory of disease transmission with the Black Death imminent is tricky to explain. The gulf of knowledge between them is huge. And although maybe a little bit less interesting to me, the contemporary sections were good too, as Tom gradually uncovers snippets of information, gradually piecing together what happened in Oberhochwold, which became Teufelheim, or Devil's Home, and eventually corrupted to Eifelheim. Tom's wife Sharon is a theoretical physicist, and she's getting closer and closer to proving that hyperspace travel is a practical possibility, that the concepts of time and distance and the speed of light are elastic. This aspect of the contemporary thread, initially a bit of a sideshow, does tie in neatly to the historical thread as the book comes to a close. I like a historical fiction. I've read quite a bit of it in the past, so I'm definitely here for a science fiction novel with a heavy dose of that. I enjoyed it. I think if you enjoyed Connie Willis's Doomsday book, which has a similar medieval vibe and a similar twin plot thread structure, then I think that this is one that you like too. Although there are obviously less aliens in Connie Willis's book. I give Eifelheim 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. So despite the fact that there were no real knockout punches, no out-and-out galactic gems, all of that means that my book of the month is The Colour of Distance by Amy Thomson. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.